Siobhan is going to go out and check, but I think we should go ahead and get started. I think this is going to be very interesting. I think you might have a lot of questions, and I want to have plenty of time. We have to be out of here by 7, so we are on a little bit of a time crunch.
I want to be out.
But anyway, a few things I probably need to report, and I think I did tell people at our November meeting that we had been contacted by a grad student from Johns Hopkins who was going to help us get our act together and digitally save what we had. And we are fortunate that Mike is here again. He has been photographing pictures that I had on loan from the Burton brothers about the Burton mine and Tropico and all that. So we are digitally saving that. We are really trying to get as much as we can digitally saved, because that's the only way it's going to survive, be there for the future. There's nobody else out there, is there? 2 more? Well, all right, Siobhan, I'm going to call you up and let Siobhan do the introduction of our speaker, and that should,
Gretchen's really nice, so I'm going to do the sales pitch. We are a cheap date. Our annual membership is $15 an individual and $20 a couple, $30 for a family, and if you have a business like heating and air conditioning, we'll take your business card for $35 a year and put it in our newsletter and put it online.
Well, there you go.
Not that I'm hustling anybody that hasn't.
Yeah, okay.
So those are up there up at the front, and insurance still has to be paid. We're not getting rich, we're not taking a cruise, we're just paying for insurance. I would like, you stop and think, there are individuals that are known by one name. We have Cher, we have Elvis, we have Madonna. And people say, oh, do you know Bob? And there's lots of Bobs. So Bob Alvis has become one word. Do you know Bob Alvis? And so many of us feel like we know Bob through Facebook. And so if this is one of your first opportunities to meet him in person, raise your hand. Okay? Bob,
Bless you.
I want you to take a look.
Bless you, my children.
Come up here, Bob, with me. When my granddaughter was little, we would take her to Disneyland and we'd get her picture done with the princesses. So if you'd like a picture with Bob today,
Oh, man.
he'd be happy to have a picture done with you.
Of course I would.
How many of you follow him on Facebook?
There you go.
And he is legendary in the Facebook community. You come back here because Mac's going to beat me if we're not in the right picture
Okay.
part here.
Okay.
And I'm more afraid of him than you.
Okay, all right.
And so when we get this opportunity tonight, it is just such a privilege. I would encourage Bob to maybe do a workshop for those of us that love history on how to write a good story, tell a good story. He is wonderful, and he can make, I tell you, I think he could make cleaning out sewage lines an interesting
I've done that
story.
article. I've done that article.
And so without further ado, it is not Bob, it is Bob Alvis here tonight. So thank you so much.
No problem. Can you hear me? Are we good?
Yeah.
Anyway, I appreciate everybody for turning out tonight and being a part of this. You know, I love to share history and try to find subject matter that's not the normal run-of-the-mill stuff, and try to find ways to inspire people to learn more, not take for granted what's around them, and to try to pass on the legacy of history to future generations. Sometimes that's a real hard sell in today's world, because everybody, you know, they think their history is no further away than this, okay? And we try to get away from that, because I do things that we call history walking, to where when you go out to a historical location and you walk in the footsteps of generations that have come before, that's when you learn and you get the feeling of what those people experienced, what they were going through, and what life was like back in those times. And that's one of those things you really try to sell to future generations. Got some more people coming in here, so I'm going to keep bloviating here, okay? So I help with the Antelope Valley Rural Museum and different factions, but being born in Lancaster in 1954, on Lancaster Boulevard there, and growing up in the community. Dad was an aerospace worker for Douglas Aircraft. My brother, Gary, who graduated from AV High School in 1958, he's the one that inspired me into my love of railroading. He used to work for Dr. Zontin down in Lancaster there, and when I was just a little kid, he would babysit me and take me down to the veterinarian's office there, and he had little model trains he would set on the floor of there, and I would play with those trains endlessly. And it didn't take long to discover snap trains. And once you got those wooden snap trains and you started going there, and Gary used to say, we would go down, and whenever the trains were coming through town, he says, there I was like 5 years old, and as the boxcars were going by, he says, here you were, this little kid, and you'd sit there and you'd be looking at the boxcars going by, going Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, and stuff. And I would just love that whole aspect. And of course, that love for railroading is carried on for years, because I was gifted with growing up during a time when I could go down to Lancaster Station there and I could ride the daylight. And I would ride for $14 was a round trip ticket to Bakersfield and back. And I would go down on a Saturday morning. I couldn't have been more than 12, 13 years old. My parents had no problem with me getting on that train and riding to Bakersfield and back. And it was just one of the best experiences for a young man to be able to have that kind of an adventure. And it was a real special time. And in the 70s, when that train service stopped here, it was a lost part of our valley heritage that had gone on for generations, and sadly it came to an end. And I don't care what people say, the Metrolink just ain't going to do it, you know. So it's just not the same feeling. So many times when I was a teenager, my friend Rick Toof and I, railroad friend of mine, we'd go up to Mojave and we'd spend all kinds of time up in Mojave, and we got to know Mr. Kelly and a lot of the guys up there, and we'd hang around the yards, and you know, we weren't troublemakers or anything like that. And the railroad guys actually kind of embraced us up there, and we enjoyed our time up there. But that started that love of discovery, to where when you look at an operation and you see how it works and how it works in the overall scheme of the history of our community, that I suddenly started thinking like, wow, this is really, really neat. And how can I continue this passion on? And my ability to do storytelling and sharing of history is that gift of that you say legendary, but you know, I just look at it as a gift to share with people in a way and stuff that makes them feel like a part of the history as I explain it. So anyway, so when I was thinking about a presentation to do, Kern Historical, I was thinking of the abandoned railroad line that actually went from, let me see if I can make this work now. Nope. Nope. Back. Hang in there. Nope. What'd I do wrong?
There you go.
There we go. Okay. So, no. Is the pointer the one on the bottom? There we go. Okay. So, from Mojave to Boron, many years ago, before Edwards Air Force base really took over the operations there. The original alignment for the railroad from Boron did not take the northerly route like it does today. It actually swung down across the dry lake bed and worked its way up to Mojave from a southerly route. Okay, it was much less of a challenge for elevation for the railroad to actually come across that route right there. So a little brief history, and somebody already brought this up as far as a question. When I state that originally it was the Southern Pacific that built the rail line from Mojave to Needles, because during that time as the railroads were struggling and fighting for,
Is that better?
yeah,
Okay.
were fighting for trackage rights and trade routes into California, Southern Pacific was just basically trying to be the octopus that had their fingers in everybody's business in California, and they didn't want any competing railroads to come into Southern California that they would have to compete with. So Southern Pacific at the time, because we had Union Pacific coming through Donner Pass and into the San Joaquin Valley, and of course they had the southern route that came through Redlands and from down south. But we didn't have an east to west alignment there that would tap into the heartland of America to come here. Well, the Santa Fe was in Kansas and they were pushing to Chicago, but an upstart railroad called the Atlantic and Pacific was being devised that would basically follow its namesake. Their original goal was to have a railroad that ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So the A&P in the 1800s was pushing from Texas to California. And what they did was they were coming and they got tracks laid all the way to Needles. And so the Southern Pacific was looking at that and go like, well, this is unacceptable because they're going to end up pushing into California. They're going to get to Barstow, and then everything is going to turn south to go through Cajon Pass. So the Southern Pacific saw an opportunity here and go, we'll build the rails from Mojave to Needles, and we will lease that property rights to the A&P to operate their trains from Needles into Mojave there. And so thus started the relationship with the Southern Pacific and the Atlantic and Pacific coming into California. So the terminus for the A&P was actually at Mojave. So when that started, Southern Pacific actually got the relationship going that still even goes on today with the Santa Fe, because eventually the A&P was picked up by the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, and they were the ones that ended up pressing into California in mass. And then that's when the relationship came together, where Southern Pacific saw what a great opportunity for us to offset a lot of our operational costs by running the railroads across the Tehachapi's. We'll go as a joint venture. We'll give the A&P trackage rights into the Central Valley, which would run on the a more westernly route than the Southern Pacific had through there. So there wouldn't be a big competition thing going on there, but it sure would help offset a lot of the costs it took to maintain the rails across Tehachapi. And that relationship still continues on today with the BNSF and the Santa Fe, Southern Pacific. So anyway, what we're going to talk about here tonight and stuff is a little bit is this alignment that goes across here, that if you're into exploring and into the history, you can still walk that line. You can go out there, and a lot of these places still exist, even though they've been long since abandoned. Sadly, and I don't know whether you're a fan or not and stuff, but a lot of the lines from Mojave here to about Sanborn are all now covered with solar fields. So we lost those track rights through there that you could actually go out and walk those lines out there. So, all right, I'm gonna roll the drum and see if I can change to the next picture. Okay, so this is a very old picture of the original alignment out of Mojave, where the A&P, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rails actually left Mojave and actually came out here and went east. Today, you know, they have the overpass that goes there, and of course the BNSF, you know, peels off and heads off towards Barstow that way. Back in those days, it was just, they'd come down through the yard and they would turn and they would head across the desert from that location. I have some pictures here, you'll see that. One thing I always want to make as we take this journey across the desert is I want you to look at the land rights and who actually owns all the property around these areas. You know, you'll see all these stuff, and it's Southern Pacific Railroad. And you'll be amazed at just how much the Southern Pacific actually owned of Southern California. So, all right, next. So, as we come down from Mojave, our first stop would be the little town of railroad station called Bissell. Bissell is out there, and once again, we're looking Southern Pacific Railroad. Man, they just about own everything. And so this is how they pretty much got their tracks right, because back in the days in the 1800s when it came to the railroading in California, the railroads were really running the show. You know, the big boys up in Sacramento, whether it was Huntington and Stanford and all those guys, they had their fingers into the land acquisitions all over California, and they did not let much get away from them. So Bissell was the next stop that came down from Mojave. And then we came down to an area where you're coming close to Edwards Air Force Base of today, and there was a station named Fleur that was right there. Now, you can barely just make out the dry lake bed here, but the railroad came through down here and turned at what was originally called Yucca, that actually ended up becoming Muroc and then Edwards Air Force Base, which you see right here at this location. So the railroad line came down through here, turned around this little abruptment of hills here and stuff, and then started a beeline across the lake bed. Okay, the dry lake bed from Muroc to here, there was actually a station out on the middle of the dry lake bed at Rogers Dry Lake there, and it was called Ceylon out there. Okay, so this was out there, and once again, Southern Pacific, everything owned by the good old Southern Pacific Railroad. And like I said, this map goes on indefinitely. So that railroad line actually went all the way across the dry lake bed, and then it came to a station that we call Rich. Now, Rich is a station that you can, if you go on the Rocket Site Road, you can still go out there and actually find the foundations. And I have a couple pictures of it, of the original train station that was called Rich out there, okay? So, this picture shows what it was like back in the day when the railroads were first coming here and they did the first alignments across the Antelope Valley and that area there. So Southern Pacific actually came down through here. This is through Lancaster. In the 1800s, a lot of people don't realize there was no Lancaster for a long time until later on in the 1800s. And the only two water stops really across the Antelope Valley were you'd water up at Mojave, and you'd also water up at a place called Alpine. It was right here where Vincent is today when you go across where the train tracks go through there. Alpine is another whole subject matter I could get into in depth, because really when it comes to the southwest part of the Antelope Valley, Alpine predates Palmdale by a long way before Pimenthal and those communities actually showed up. So I always kind of figured that Alpine was really the basis of railroad operations, that where there was a post office and saloons and everything else all around that community right there. And when you're going through that area where the train tracks, the Sierra Highway crosses the train tracks there just south of Una Lake there, the bottomless lake, that was the hub for the Antelope Valley. So also you can see, you know, now the A&P we came down here and turned and came across and then headed off to Boron there. So this is what early on it looked like before the land masses just turned into population centers and things like that. So this is in the very early days, and I believe Roseman right here was strictly called Sand. They just named it after the location. It was just Sand. There was no Roseman. It was just
Sand Creek.
Sand Creek. There you go. So on the railroad maps, it's just abbreviated Sand. So Sand Creek was the actual designation for Roseman back in those days. And it's funny, as a side note, I was doing some research from an old book that there was 3 Chinamen hand cart that had gone up to Mojave to pick up a pig for slaughter for the track crews down in Mojave. I mean, down in Lancaster. And when they came around the end of Roseman there, around the hills there from Ansel, they picked up so much speed they lost control of the hand cart and it flipped and it killed 2 of them. And so it's funny how, it's funny or sad, but it speaks to the times. They came out there and they were more worried, the other crew members are all worried about getting the pig, you know, and stuff, than the dead Chinaman. So an interesting part of the story was they said they buried them near the railroad tracks there somewhere. And somewhere today, those 2 Chinamen are buried somewhere along the railroad tracks here in Roseman and stuff in unmarked graves that, you know, maybe generations from now somebody may accidentally find it. But that was a standard procedure, even with building of the line to Needles, or any railroad for that matter of fact, especially down through Soledad Canyon and stuff. They would just bury the track workers where they fell. They would just dig graves right alongside the railroad tracks, and they'd bury them right there. So a little bit of history there. I always tell everybody, walk softly when you walk the earth, because you never know who you're walking on. So anyway, this was another map that kind of showed, once again, that alignment there as it comes out and comes down here. At this point, let me see if I can see that really good. A little fuzzy there. I think this point, Muroc was actually called Rod at this time, which was short for Rodriguez, which was the family that was there before the Coram family actually showed up. So, so we think back to those times in the 1800s when they were building those railroads. Now this is an Atlantic and Pacific locomotive that was actually over in Needles, California. And you know, when you love history as much as most of us do, to visualize those moments in time, what it would have been like to go out and watch these type of locomotives working their way across the desert and just taking it for granted. You know, back in those days, people just took it for granted. This is the visuals that we get. Today, how neat would it be and stuff to actually go back in time and witness the railroads and their operations back in those days. You know, the closest we get to this nowadays is going down to Disneyland and riding around Walt's Kingdom for a couple hours, you know. But it's just not the same, because you keep thinking, my gosh, and what travel was like back in those days, and how manly the men were, and even the women travelers and everything, and unair-conditioned cars dealing with coal, wood, and the hostilities of the desert crossing. You know how hard it is now just to go to Vegas in the summertime if you don't have a car with air conditioning in it. Could you imagine making your way over to Needles or even the Vegas areas and stuff with no air conditioning in a locomotive, and you're sitting there and there's a boiler right next to you at what's the temperature on that thing? Oh man, you were some tough individuals back then. So this is Mojave Station. Now, there's 2 sides to Mojave Station that a lot of people don't realize. That on the west side was actually the Southern Pacific Railroad on the west side. The A&P, the Atlantic and Pacific, and Santa Fe eventually served on the right side, the east side of the train station. This is where the line came in that was actually going to Needles and going back and forth there. So when the trains would come into Mojave, you had the A&P, and you had the Southern Pacific, and of course, just north of the station is when the lines would converge and they become one. So this is a very early picture back when the Mojave Station was a 2-story. This is probably post a little bit of the Harvey house that was there. And it wasn't long after this that, of course, this station burnt down more times than you can care to think. But it had a hard time surviving, and even had a hard time surviving in the end there. So, sadly. So here's a picture of Mojave Station, and this is actually A&P Railroad rolling stock right here on that side of the station, right here. And now this picture here does show it during the period of the time when the Harvey house was there, with the Harvey girls and all that during the operations here. So this is actually a A&P cattle car, and then you have your tank cars. And a lot of people don't realize those tank cars were really critical crossing the Southwest, because you didn't have all the water stops along the way like you do nowadays, and water towers and water stops. So a lot of that water had to be brought to the locales to supplement the water for drinking, for locomotive, for railway work. and things like that. And so out at Newberry Springs, everybody know where Newberry Springs is? One of the greatest underground deposits of water in the world, in Santa Fe. And the A&P utilized that water from that underground aquifera there to feed a railroad that stretched all the way across the Southwest. And you would see mile-long trains practically of tank cars just transporting water to all the outposts along the railroad. This is what kind of remains of the A&P Santa Fe line that was on the east side of the Mojave Depot, which sat right here. So this is, when you look at this buildup, because the railroad ties were between that, but when you look at all this buildup here, most of you people will realize that that's the buildup from all the grease, oil, and debris that the locomotives, when they were sitting, would drip onto the ground. And it would build up between the rails and then the ties like that. And you can go out when you find old fence post rail lines today. You'll see sometimes there'll be that oil pitch on these railroad ties that they're using for fin poles. Well, that just means, you know, back in the old days, locomotives used to sit on top of that and drip their oil when they were running up and down the railroad lines like that. So it kind of dates them back to that time period. So this is Mojave. This is the A&P Southern Santa Fe line. There's the station right down there. This is Southern Pacific. On the west side of the station, there's actually a steamer right here waiting to dispatch. This line right here was the one that would head to the east to Needles. This is the turn, both these lines right here. And there was a storage track here for a lot of years that had 100, it seems like there was 100 old refrigeration cars that were stacked up out there that they would use them for storage. But this is where I went. And this was another one of those things when, here's Old Sierra Highway here, they would cross the railroad tracks right there. And I'll tell you what, there was nothing worse back in the day than trying to drive through Mojave in a car without the overpasses, because between the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe and stuff, there was constant train movement, and you could be sitting at those crossing gates forever there as you were going. Let's see here. So as we left Mojave here, this is where the old alignment still is through the desert right here. So you can follow, back in the days, we used to get our old four-wheel drives and trucks and motorcycles, whatever and stuff, and we could actually drive the entire length of the rail line until you got to Edwards Air Force Base current, to where you would run into all kinds of trouble with the SPs and everything, because you couldn't go further. So here we are, now we're looking kind of southeast, and this is where the rail line ran across away from Mojave, heading towards Boron there. And like I said, today now this is all solar fields. They cover all this with solar fields. And it was kind of heartache and stuff, you know, because I used to love driving and finding these, because you would find old railroad artifacts as you were traversing the desert when you were looking for things. And it was always fun and it was exciting. It was like a treasure hunt when you go out there and see what you could stumble across. You know, so here's a picture of me in my truck looking, you know, to the east again. This is where we would be coming up, looking out towards Bissell, the train station that was at Bissell. And once again, I don't know if you can see right there, and there's one on that side. Those were switch tower stands that were still out. They're still out there, and there's still a lot of those along the old right-of-way out there that you can come across. These were actually, you had the switch tower with the signal on it, but you also had the battery box that you would have the batteries in that would actually power the rails there. So this was kind of a cool thing, because there was a drain underneath one of the, out there where the washes would come across underneath the railroad tracks. And one day I was there and stuff, and you know, you always run into coyotes and rattlesnakes. You have no problem finding plenty of those out there. But I just happened to be looking down underneath here, and I pulled this out. Anybody know what that is? Guess? Journal box cover. Good job. So this is what they would use. Here, I think I got a picture. Here's what that looked like when where I found it, and this was the bridge here. By the way, the old wooden construction dates back to the 1800s and stuff when it comes, because all the newer ones were all concrete and stuff. So the wooden ones, when you came across these and stuff, you realized you were looking at stuff that was over 100 years old. So there is the journal box cover right there. You see it? And what the train crews and the rail people had to do was, in the old day, they had to oil those bearings on those railroad cars. So you'd have your guys go through the yard and they'd flip up these doors and they'd pour the oil in there to grease the bearings on the cars and stuff, and then this would clip back down. So that particular bearing cover on that specific one that I found probably dates from almost the 1920s, early 1930s, during that time period. So here we are, we're coming down the main line. We're getting closer to Bissell as we're coming up on it. And there is the storage facility that was on the south side of the tracks at the train location was called Bissell. Okay, so here's our rail line coming down through here. And overall views I have of this location from the time period when it was active show that we had actually quite a big railroad operation going out here, because we had several off tracks, passing tracks that were here. And we had a pretty prominent telegraph operation going in out of here. So here's Bissell with the dilapidated storage building, and the railroad tracks used to pull right up alongside here, and you would have the storage. They would be open on this side, and they would unload the box cars and flat cars or whatever they were delivering in here. This is the well that fed the old water tower out there, okay? It's still out there, the old cistern for the water that came over here with the tower that actually fed the locomotives that were going across there. So you can, on the north side of the tracks, you can see this. This is the foundation for the old train station. The train station actually sat right here on this footing that went around here, and this was the part of the walkway that was around there. The train tracks actually run right here, right in front of where the station was. And this is the posts that are still left out there from the original water tower out there, and they're still sitting there weathering away, you know, waiting for the next train that will never come. So, and then as you see right here, you know, once again, the station here, this was the rail alignment as it was leaving this location, and the train was heading now east, and now it would venture to the end of the valley here, turn, go to the south of this mountain right here, and then it would make its way on to Edwards Air Force Base, Muroc, Rod, Yucca, whatever it was at the time. So that's where you're heading there. So here is those switch stand boxes that you can still find out there. This is where it would actually bolt here, and of course there you had, many years ago, you had the old semaphore signals with the arms you would have, and then you had the target lights that came years later. This is the box that would hold the batteries that would power that up, because you didn't have power out there. So railroad operations actually had individuals that were assigned to going around making sure the batteries and all the battery boxes were fresh, okay, and up and operating. This is what those batteries look like that were actually in those battery boxes. I'm lucky to have some of them that I've saved, you know, and it's just amazing. These were filled with solution and everything, and you had the two dissimilar metals here that would create the electricity, and then they would wire up here and stuff, and they would become part of the circuit for the signals out there. So, but as you go across the desert, X amount of miles or whatever, you would come across these boxes that are still out there today that used to support the rail movement operations back in those days. So the next station that you came across was Fleur. Okay, Fleur was right here, and many years ago I was out there and I actually found somewhat the location of where the Fleur train station was. And the Fleur train station actually predated Muroc out there, because it was early 1900s when the station at Fleur came into existence. Today, I still work out at the base and I go out there, but they get real nervous out there when you start pulling out cameras and you drive around the base and start taking pictures. So anyway, I told George out at the Flight Test Museum, any pictures I take out there have to be okayed by the base, security officers to make sure I didn't take a picture with anything in the background. But trust me, there's not really a lot to see about Fleur, because the original train station was actually where housing was, and you can go out towards the dump area at Edwards and stuff. It was on that alignment there. And you can still, once again, see the alignment as it goes across the dry lake bed. It's funny, this is Mr. Fleur, who that train station was actually named after. And the Santa Fe was really proud of their employees, and all these stations were named after Santa Fe people. And the same with Bissell, and the same with Rich. And I got something here I'll read in a few minutes and stuff to tell you a little bit about each one of these individuals, just to give you a little background on what that was all about. But this is Mr. Fleur, and it's so hard to come across these pictures nowadays. When you find something like this, it's a real gift. And Carol Stevens, who's Antelope Valley historian also, she happened to find this picture, and the minute I opened up and saw it, it was like, oh man, it was like that Indiana Jones moment. Like, oh man, this is the best thing ever. My wife thinks I'm a lunatic, because what are you ranting and raving about? What's all so exciting? I go, I got a picture of Mr. Fleur. So well, who is that? So trust me. So you have to live it, guys. You really do. So this is a station at Muroc. So Muroc was our next stop as we traversed the old alignment that went across there. Muroc had passenger trains that would service it twice a day. During the war years, at South Base there and at Muroc was a key of activity. So many GIs, airmen, went in and out of that old door. You can't even imagine how many GIs that had been stationed at Muroc during the war, and everybody that was coming there for training and things like that actually came out here by rail and actually walked through that door. This is a very, very early picture of Muroc, as the train tracks right here. The station is right down here. The water tower, the buildings and everything on the backside, which basically became kerosene flats during the aviation heydays and stuff, was part of the Muroc clan, which, and of course I don't have to tell everybody why it was named Muroc, right? We all know it was Quorum spelled backwards, but the Santa Fe already had a Quorum station somewhere, so they just switched the letters around to make it Muroc. The railroad operations here were pretty intense. They had a lot of stuff that went here that eventually went down to service the railroad yards at South Base down there. And it was very remote duty back in the days. And a matter of fact, there was a railway car before they had the station. They would just set up railroad operations in an old box car, and the guys would run the railroad operations out of the box cars down there. And one time there was a locomotive, a train was going through, and the guy didn't come out from the railroad car to do his signaling and things like that, and they thought it was kind of strange, so they telegraphed back to the next train that was coming through to stop and check on him, and a rattlesnake had got in and bit him, and he was dead. So, and they found him in the old boxcar train station. He was all, curdled up and having a really bad day. So anyway, that was part of the tough duty of this type of stuff. And today, we talk about Mojave greens and rattlesnakes and things like that. You can imagine back in those days, because the populations were unfestered, you can imagine the rodents and everything that you had to deal with back in those days. So this is one of the very early pictures of the Muroc train station that was out there, if you want to call it a train station. But you notice something very familiar about that. If you've ever been to the Boron Railway, Boron Museum, it's the same building. Oh man, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. It's the same building, even with the bay window and things like that. Similar construction, because these were built around the turn of the century, around 1900. So they're pretty much the same. And I always tell everybody, when it comes to railroad structures and things like that, railroads, once they found a design that worked, they would replicate those everywhere. These weren't just one-offs. A lot of this stuff was prefabbed in a carpentry shop that belonged to the railroad, put on a flat car, and they would haul the materials out to wherever they needed a station, and their carpenters would go out and bang these things up. They were almost like kits that they would go out there and do. And it didn't matter whether it was Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, Eastern railroads and stuff, it was the same thing, you know. So this is kind of a cool picture because, you know, it's a station master here at Muroc, and as you see, the railroad tracks head out to the dry lake bed, and they would go across the dry lake bed. You know, in all my years of searching and wanting to see it, I have never found a picture of a train going across that dry lake bed. To me, that would be like the holy grail of Muroc train pictures if I could see something like that. I could imagine a steam locomotive in the middle of that dry lake bed going across there, and all the GIs and everybody during the war years and all the traveling and the amount of passenger trains from the 1800s on came across this, crossing that dry lake bed. And what a sight that must have been, seeing people coming from the East Coast or from the Midwest and seeing the dry lake bed and the Joshuas for the first time. Oh man, what an experience that was. And just to share that kind of visual of what it would have been like to travel across America back in those days, and especially across our own dry lake bed here here. So when the railroads came in 1952, 53, the Air Force wanted the dry lake bed back, or they wanted it without a railroad going through it because it was a natural airfield that served so well for air operations and things like that. So they struck a deal with the Santa Fe to say, hey, let's move the train station, let's move all the rail operations further north away from the dry lake bed. And that's how our alignment that we're talking about today met its demise, because of the Air Force and the need for that land for the dry lake bed for air operations during that time. This is a very neat picture because this is 3751, which happens to be the steam locomotive that's restored down in LA and actually still travels today. We'll go out on excursion, things like that. And it's actually pulling one of the early Santa Fe passenger trains through that area. And this is the station they built, and it was called Muroc. And you can still go out today, and the foundation for this train station is still out there. You can actually walk up to it and you can see the plans to it there. And it's just as you're going out the north gate of Edwards Air Force Base, BNSF has a maintenance yard right there. Well, just down a little bit to the west there, you can actually go down there, and if you're brave and you want to challenge the railroad security people and stuff, you can go out there. A lot of times they'll even mess with you. As long as they know you're a railroad fan and you're not a malcontent, they'll basically just wave you off and go do your thing and be a part of it. So this is that same station looking towards, there's a little bit of Edwards right there. This is before NASA and a lot of the buildings showed up out here. This is that station in the snow looking south across there. And of course you got your railroad lines right here. And I always love that Joshua right there. I just thought, what a cool thing. People traveling from the east, they come out here for the first time, and if they had to get off here, I'm pretty sure that Joshua met a lot of friends that got off those trains back in those days. People go like, what the heck is that? And say, believe it or not, it's actually a flower. It's not a tree. But anyway, kind of a cool scene there. So, and I said when South Base opened and all the air operations were going on there, we had the railroad that actually came down through here, and we had all kinds of service tracks as the railroads were bringing all kinds of materials and supplies and everything to the air operations that were at South Base. Here's the NACA and the Douglas hangar out there. There's the old downtown section of South Base there, and of course we're looking Mount Baldy's way back out there, and of course the dry lake bed here. And I believe this one is actually the hospital out there. But anyway, the railroads actually came from the Muroc location, came down here and dropped in and stuff and went across here. And we had all kinds of rail operations. And I heard just recently that they're actually looking to reopen the rail lines onto the base from the original, not the original alignment, but from the BNSF today, and actually instituting those rail operations and bring them back down to supply that's at the northern location of the base now, which would be kind of cool. I like that. So, Salon, how in the world could you have a railroad station in operation out in the middle of the Rogers Dry Lake? This was right out on the dry lake bed, okay? And what we had here is we had the Mojave Clay Corporation plant that was out there. Okay, we actually had railroad tracks here, and we had railroad cars set off there, and they had an open pit mine out there. And once again, one of those pictures I didn't include with this, that's just a scale of what was going on out there. But once again, they were taking the mud from the dry lake beds, and they were shipping them to companies across the United States, because even in your own Roseman down here, you had the silt operations just on the other side of the crossing there to the right here in Roseman, because they would use that silt from that to actually lubricate the drilling equipment bits that were going down, because you could put that slurry down there and it was almost like a grease. It was so slimy that it would work really good. So this was the operation there. And when you're driving down the 58 to Boron, you can still today see the Clay Mine Road. You know, you pass that. And that's where its namesake came from. A lot of people don't even know that. They're like, what the heck is that? So anyway, that's what that is. So here's the Mojave Clay Corporation when it came from the tracks. And look at the size of the operation they had out there. All these buildings and everything that was out there. So that was a pretty big deal when it was going back in the days. And I believe that when in 53, when they abandoned the railroad tracks across there, I think that's when your Roseman aspect of the Mojave, of the Clay Corporation, actually moved here to Roseman. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure that was a correlation to where operations were moved here, and they were taking the lake bed sediment off of Roseman Dry Lake and bringing it over there and processing it and sending it out. So let's see what we got here. Mercury Boulevard and Rich Road. Rich is the next train station. As we were coming across, we'd come off the dry lake bed and we start making our way towards Boron proper. And today you can go out there and you can still drive on Rich Road, even though it upsets me a lot that they've changed the name of Rich Road to, what is it, Rocket Site Road now or something like that. Because Rich Station was actually named out of a human being that actually lived and was held in prominence by the Santa Fe and things like that. And it always bothers me when people start changing names because they think it's not relevant anymore. Well, it's sure relevant to that individual and his history and his families that came out here. He was part of that history and part of that legacy. You know, so he's saying like, you know what, we need something more cool. Let's get a name that says Rocket Site Road or something like that. Because who the heck, what's this rich guy? And things like that. So that just kind of stuff just rubs me the wrong way, you know. But anyway. Here is the foundation for the Rich train station that was out there. It's still there today. You're driving along Rich Road, which is in this picture, it's right behind me where I'm taking this picture. And this is the railroad tracks that came through here. And, you know, I've gone out there years ago and I did some metal detecting around there, and some of the cool things I found, I'm in awe. Every once in a while, God blesses you with a little historical nugget that goes, and it speaks so much of history that it just excites you to know in. This is out of Rich. This is the railroad bed was up high when it came through a lot of the depressions as you cross the valley there, but they had to have the rail bed up high because when water would accumulate around there. So this is actually built here to where the steam locomotives would pull up here, and so if the engineer or somebody had to get off the train, they would step down onto this foundation here and they wouldn't go toppling off the side of the rail bed and stuff all the way down to the dirt. And so the station would be considered like right over in this area, right over here to that location. This is the well that was actually out there at Rich that supplied water to the water tower that was out there. It's all been filled in good. You know, I like that when they fill them in because all kinds of varmints and desert tortoises can fall in one of those and have a real bad day. And so every time they fill in places like that, it's a good thing. Here's an old rail. This is really kind of a cool thing. This was where a bumper track was, where the tracks would come down here, and there was actually a crossbuck right here. But when you look real careful at this rail and you really dig into it, you find out that rail was rolled in 1911 is when that rail was actually made and brought out there. And so when you see stuff like that, and every time you go out, even down here in Roseman, if you go down and you walk along the old spur track where they used to do the sugar beets, and those cars down there, you can walk on there and the dates will still be stamped in the on the steel and stuff of when those rails were rolled out of the factories back in those days. So kind of cool. You can still find that kind of history. This is looking towards the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base right here. This is where the existing rails still exist out here. Rich would be just like in this location right here. And this is a very interesting switch arrangement here that they have. I talked to some Santa Fe people, and they're still scratching their head what they were trying to accomplish with that rail alignment, but it doesn't look like anything they'd ever had to work on. And it's funny, when I was looking at that switchover and I found this, and I go like, it's that aha moment. Was that 1891 that thing was actually manufactured and placed out there? So this goes back to Atlantic and Pacific days of the railroad here and stuff. And of course, a lot of this stuff was reused. It never really went bad. But you know, when you find something from 1891 like this, you know, if you're a history buff and you like this stuff, you get excited about it. It's cool, you know, and stuff. You think how long that thing's been around, and you know, and what it's seen. So here's a couple more of those switch boxes, the battery box and the signal tower that was actually between Rich and Boron out there. It's funny when you look here and we talk about like the station Rich, you know, you look here, I have books that tell what each station, the name and where it came from. So for instance, here you see Rich, California, and he was the chief dispatcher at Needles, California for the railroad. So this is how these stations would get their names, the majority of them. And Paris, California was named from Fred T. Paris, and he was a, engineman? So you had an engineer for Paris, California. You probably all know where Paris is down there, and Santa Fe, but you know, Peabody, Kansas. Anyway, this is the way we name it. And same with Bissell, and same with Fleur. I found all these same connections to these type of individuals there. Southern Pacific was a little different. You know, they would name railroad stations after individuals, but they were more about regions like Mojave, Tehachapi, Bakersfield, things like that. It was all about a region. That's the big argument about a Lancaster, because that is the great mystery, because when the big earthquake came in, 1906, and the Southern Pacific's headquarters burnt down, they lost all the history of where all these names came from. And Lancaster's been a tug of war between so many people as to where that name came from. And they're saying, oh, it's some guy from Lancaster, California. It really wasn't. And it was actually when I was doing some research back in Winslow, Arizona, that I came across a family of Lancaster individuals or railroad men for the Southern Pacific. And they were in this region in the early 1800s. And I'm going like, well, that probably makes the connection for me. And when I was talking to Sacramento and the Rail Museum up there, then I gave my hypothesis, I think I said that word right, to them. They agreed with me. They said, Bob, that's more than likely where that station, the town of Lancaster got its name from, was a railroad man that was working for the Southern Pacific. So anyway, you've seen this. So there is this one spur here that says United States Air Force right here, and it's called the Government Spur right here. This spur came into existence in 1954 at the beginning of the space race, because what did we do? We were getting ready for the rocket age, and they needed, out there at the rocket site, where my daughter works today, no pride there, right? Anyway, this was where all this type of operation was going on. And let me see if I can get back to that. Oh, don't go away. So you can go out there today and they still have the rail lines that actually run all over the mountain stuff, even though they're all grown over. And I've worked out there as a contractor several times. You got to be really careful with the camera even up there. You can't get crazy taking pictures everywhere. But this old tower here, I don't know if any of you people know what that is, but that's the original tower for the Atlas rocket program. They would bring the Atlas rockets to the site up here by railway car, and they would bring them in there and they'd hoist it in there. And of course, they'd strap it into that tower right there, and then they would run those rocket engines. The Atlas rocket would sit in there, and you could see that all over the Antelope Valley. They said back in the days when they were firing those rockets off, you could see it glowing out there, and that went on for a lot of years, even up to what, the 1990s and things like that, if they ever lit that stuff off out there. So anyway, it's kind of cool. These cars here were still up there. It's one of those pictures I snuck out of there under threat of having my life in. But these cars were specially made because what did they carry? Helium. There was actually a helium plant in the Midwest, and because they needed helium for the rocket engine tests and things like that, so they had these special cars made. And there's all kinds of jokes about these things that, which didn't make any sense, but it was always great, talk, because they would say the only rail car that once it was fully loaded would weigh less than it did when it was empty, because it was helium and stuff. We don't really know in the scientific world if that is exactly true, but it was always good for a story. And nowadays, they what they did up there is they took the trucks off. As a matter of fact, see these trucks right over here that went under the cars? They took these off and they permanently mounted these cars, and now they use them for nitrogen. They stored nitrogen in those for the rail, for the rocket test site engines up there. So there's one of the switch stands that's still up there at the rocket site. I told my daughter, if they ever want to get rid of that, I know some place I'd love to see that end up at, but I don't think that's going to happen, because every once in a while they'll tap in and they'll reinstitute, like they're doing down on the main base. They bring the railroads back, and they still run occasionally. They'll run certain cars and stuff up to the rocket sites there to deliver things like that. So it's still an active spur that's up there. So, this is one of those really cool pictures that I came across that, you would think, okay, it's the flying wing, it's out at Edwards Air Force Base, right? But what's the cool thing for me in this picture? Anybody know? That train, right? Oh, look at that, I blew it. Oh no. This is what happens when old technology meets an old man's hand. Yeah, it's the train that's on the alignment of that original abandoned rail line, and it's probably just left Fleur over here, and it's heading towards Bissell that was over here. And of course, we're looking at a 1940s picture here, and that's pretty sure, from what I can tell, is a caboose on that train there. But I thought, how cool is that? Because I have another picture in a book of a train actually traversing that area. But sadly, I don't have any pictures of the train station at Bissell, the train station at, Rod or Rich or Fleur. What I wouldn't give to have a picture like that. And in today's world where everything is digitized and things like that, the real treasures that we find for our generation are in photo albums all across America that are pictures lost to time, because people no longer share those anymore, and they usually end up at the yard sales, and they're $5, you can have the whole thing. But that one GI from, let's say, Kentucky, that was coming across the dry lake bed in World War II with his camera and took a picture of him coming across that dry lake bed, to me, that's the gift that just keeps on giving, if I could ever find a picture like that, because that's where we get to share this stuff, and why it's so important to keep that history coming forward. And I wish, we call digital formats nowadays and stuff, they call it digital dust, because eventually it'll just all go away. It ends up getting lost. But a picture, 35 millimeter Kodachrome picture and things like that, that is something that will live on for generations and be shared. And sure, we share pictures via the internet and Facebook and things like that, but things like this are just hard to come by anymore. They just don't hardly exist. So this is funny. This was my final picture of the series, because it was the rail lines here looking out towards Boron right there. This is where the line actually came to an end, and it crosses where I'm standing with Rich Rocket Site Road right behind me as I take this picture. And for years and years and years, the Santa Fe kept their old wooden reefer cars out there, strung up for as far as you could see because they weren't using them anymore. And then they had a contractor come out there and just scrap them all. Just went right down the line, scrapping them all. And several years after that, I remember walking out here and I found so much railroad material from those old railroad cars that dated back. Some of those railroad cars went back to the 1911s. And if you ever go to my house, you realize I have a hard time throwing anything away. You know, and so my backyard is like, oh my God, when I die, my kids are going to hate me forever. But you know what? It's one of those things. So this was the end of the line for in 1953 for the rail operations that went across the dry lake bed there. And I always say, you know, just my friends Jeff and Kate back there, they go with me on these walks every time. And when you're out in the middle of the desert and it's quiet and you don't hear anything, and all of a sudden, off in the distance, you can hear the train running on the northern tracks there, and you hear those whistles and things like that. And you go, my God, how neat would it be to go back in time and those big steam locomotives running across the desert and those big clouds of steam and the whistle and the bells and the individuals that were larger than life. The engineers back in those days were the rock stars that we look at today. They were the rock stars because everybody looked up to that man that was sitting in that cab of that locomotive and say, like, someday when I grow up, that's what I want to be, you know, stuff. And it was just the neatest time period in our history to think of what life was like back in those days. So I'd make sure I don't have anything else. Yeah, we go back to the original. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Okay, you know, if you have any questions, you know, I can answer anything you got. So anybody, can you turn on the light for a second? Okay, go ahead. Yes.
What time frame did they shift operations to the Northern Railway?
1953.
53.
When you go on the underpass out the north gate, you go underneath the railroad tracks, the new ones, and there's a civilian walkway to the left, and it's still stamped in the concrete, 1953, of when they built that thing. By the way, here's a question: how many know? Who knows the original name of boron? Anybody know? It was not always boron. It was AMARGO, Armago. That was the name it was given in 1912. Okay, and one thing I wanted to say, Bissell was named for W.A. Bissell. It was named in 1893, and it was active till 1953 when they did it, and he was the assistant traffic manager for the Santa Fe. Fleur, C.G. Fleur, was named in 1907 and was active till 1953. He was the division superintendent. And then, of course, Rich was named after the chief dispatcher for the Needles train operations over there. Yucca, which became Muroc, and many other names. 1882 is when Yucca, the train station in Yucca, which became Muroc, which became Edwards and stuff, was laid out there. And so Rodriguez was 1898 to 1907, and Muroc was 1910 to 1951. So one last thing I'll say, and then we'll finish this up. You think back to the time and stuff, the rail operations on there. Starting in the 1800s, the Santa Fe and the Atlantic and Pacific ran passenger trains through there en masse. And those trains, the names that went from San Francisco to Chicago, sometimes across that lake bed 2 or 3 times a day. There was the Overland Express, the Eastern Express, the Tourist Flyer, the Santa Fe 8, the Missionary, the Overland, the Chicago Flyer, the San Francisco Limited, and the very last passenger train from San Francisco to Chicago was what? Anybody know? The San Francisco Chief. And that finally, and they actually ran that till Amtrak took over, and the demise of the passenger trains for the Santa Fe came to an end, and traversing through our valley here. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
In a lot of your pictures, you showed that the rail bed was there, but the ties and the metal rails were gone.
Yes.
Was it worthwhile for them to?
Jerry, would you repeat that one more time?
I hear you.
just in the picture, the metal rails and the railroad ties were gone. I just was wondering, was it worth them to salvage that stuff?
I'll tell you.
Did the government make them take that stuff out?
No, you know what? That steel still serves today in some format, everything, because they melted and smelted all that metal down, and it just gets repurposed. A lot of that rail, you can go around and lesser track operations in areas where they don't have high weight limits, they'll actually use those older rails because they really don't go bad, you know, during those times. And you know, the abandonment, the railroad ties, you can still go through the Owens Valley there and you can still see all the railroad ties stacked up on guys' farms, because those railroad ties and stuff were priceless because they had the creosote in them and they last forever, and you could use those for all kinds of things. So the railroads, my gosh, they're even today, they're still selling them at Lowe's and Home Depot. You know, they hate to throw any of that stuff away because it's all still doable, even though some people think, there's some chemicals in there that don't really, you know, tend itself. Just don't use those around a garden or something like that. But yeah, when they pulled all that stuff up, and once again they would go, and the train would go along, and the crane would just load that rail right up onto a flat car, and off they would go with it, and it'd go off and get repurposed somewhere. So yes.
Did they use a lot of rail during the war?
Oh yeah, and you know, boron actually came and hit its stride in World War II. You know, that's when boron really got into the action, because the borax was such a necessary commodity for the war effort. The amount of train operations going in and out of there, and that's when Boron and Boron Company really started getting its mojo going and stuff like that. So yeah.
Steve Sturck, fourth generation from Lincoln.
I know those Sturks.
I worked at NASA Armstrong.
Yeah.
So where from NASA Armstrong to 1600 did the track come between?
You know where the control tower is on on the base there?
Okay.
The new control tower, just not more than probably, man, Katie would probably know this more. What, like 100 yards maybe just north of that control tower is where that railroad would go across there. And you go there today, you can still see where that rail line comes across the base and it turns down around, I think it's Wolf is the street that goes by the flight line there, and it parallels Wolf there for a little bit, and then it just disappears there. George and those guys are out there, is always teasing me that they're going to let me go out sometime, and it's around old Kerosene Flats, and they said, you know, and let me actually go out there and walk that area, because that area is really still kind of undisturbed where the railroad operations were there. So anyway, good stuff, exciting stuff. So anybody else? Really? Oh, I see one. Don't be shy.
For all of
I
us.
just had another thought. I didn't hear you say anything about it, but did any of the silver from Cerro Gordo come down through Mojave and go on that spur?
You know, it's interesting that you would be talking about that, because that's kind of another thing with the 20 mule teams and all that, bringing that ore down to Mojave. And when the railroads actually go up Nadano, and I'm trying to think of his name, the mule train guy that was the big guy, Nadano, his operation was right there north of Mojave. Just as the railroad goes around the mountain there was a train station there called Warren, and you can still see the foundation where the railroads would meet with the 20 mule team trains that would transfer that ore, the silver ore and things like that, to the railroad cars there. And of course the railroad cars would come back and supply the hay and water for the teams to go back and forth there. So you can still find that location, but that is true. A lot of that stuff, once they got it to a railhead, they were good to go. And then eventually Southern Pacific would go out to Trona, and they would head up to the Owens Valley, and they'd get all the way to Lone Pine, and then to Owino, where they would meet up with the narrow gauge there. So once those railroad operations got up there was really no more need for the 20 mule teams to carry on the operations up there. So more good history stuff there. So yes?
One more question here.
Sure.
You were talking about the solar fields
Yeah.
that have taken over.
Yeah.
If Southern Pacific had owned that land, are they now leasing it to these solar fields?
You know what? That'd be a good question, because we're talking about from the 1800s when the Southern Pacific basically owned everything. Or I think over a period of time, once again, land lease, and purchases and things like that got away. I don't think today Southern Pacific really cares to have any invested interest in that. But you know what? You're right. Nowadays, what's the price tag on that stuff if they still own the rights to all that property? My gosh, the amount of money that it would be worth would be staggering. So anyway, it's true. Like I said, it's hard for a lot of us historians to see things kind of bowled over for the sake of progress, but that's the world we live in. But it's up to a lot of us to carry on and make sure that the legacy of what came before carries on, even though we can't physically go out there and we can't touch it. I always tell everybody when we talk about Lancaster Station, what's the big deal? It burned down, move on, what's the deal? People don't realize that for a lot of our parents and grandparents' generations, do you realize that was their gateway to the world, was the local train station? They didn't have LAX. They didn't have the big air terminals and things that we go to today. When they discovered the world, it was stepping off a train into a small town, or it was getting on that train and traveling the adventures that were waiting for you to be discovered and things like that. And that's why railroad stations and things like that have a spiritual connection to a community, because everything a community is all started from those people that stepped off those trains and got on those trains. And that's why it's a heartache when we see people just take that history and that legacy and just brush it off and say, doesn't mean anything to us, and don't get me started on politics, because that's another class. So anyway, but thank you for listening to me. All right.
We need to thank Bob again, because he came early and he actually set up all the chairs. So not only has he talked,
A full service guy. No problem. So you can go.
I am being told I need to get back in the frame. Siobhan, would you like to give us a clue about our next meeting? All right. Our next meeting is a mystery, so stay tuned. And again, thank you all for coming.
And